Started. We're only waiting for a few stragglers, so we'll start the program. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping items. There are restrooms outside and the doors are unlocked, so feel free to use them. I would like to thank our sponsors for the CLE this year, the Minority Bar Association of Western New York, the Young Lawyers Committee of the Bar Association of Erie County, as well as the Diversity Committee of the Women's Bar Association, WBOSNY. Okay, I'm not gonna try to pronounce that all out. Due to their sponsorship, we were able to provide the lovely lunch that we have for you today. So thank all three organizations for supporting the Volunteer Lawyers Project. You should have gotten a yellow evaluation form when you checked in. Please complete this form at the end of the CLE so that you'll be able to receive credit. We appreciate your feedback. So just remember to complete this form at the end of the CLE and turn it in when you sign out outside where you checked in with Rebecca. There are trash cans, or one trash can in the back room, so when you're done with your plates and your utensils and cups, you can utilize the trash can. Okay, so it is my pleasure to introduce the Volunteer Lawyers Project Executive Director, Robert Alardo. He will be coming up to welcome and thank you all for being here today and taking part in this CLE.
Thanks, Carisha. That's really all I'm going to take is just a few seconds to welcome you all and thank you for being here and participating with the Volunteer Lawyers Project. You know, it's through efforts like all of you are making that we're able to reach many more people and help to close that justice gap. And I can tell you that we've talked with Judge Ferletto, the administrative judge for the district. You know, she, on behalf of the courts, is very, very excited about this program. It's really filling a need that will be beneficial not only to our clients, but will help in the administration of justice with the courts, because the people are going to show up much better prepared because of all your efforts. And that's going to make it better for the courts, but also better for the tenants who are afraid of losing their home and becoming homeless. So I won't take any more time. I want to again just thank you. And this is an exciting program that Carisha has really created, and we're really excited at VLP about it getting launched. So thank you.
Okay, so our first speaker today is Gail Town Murphy. Ms. Murphy is the pro bono manager for the Erie County Bar Association Volunteer Lawyers Project. She works with law firms, private attorneys, and bar associations to increase pro bono legal assistance. Prior to joining VLP in November 2013, for over 20 years, Ms. Murphy was in private practice, focusing on children's rights and the rights of individuals with disability. She was a special education teacher. She taught at Buffalo State College, and she taught in the UB Law School Clinic Legal Education Program. Gail is active in the community, serving on many professional organizations such as the American Bar Association, the New York State Bar Association, the Bar Association of Erie County, Women Lawyers of Western New York, and the Western New York chapter of the Women's Bar Association of the State of New York, as well as community boards. She was named Lawyer of the Year by the Women Lawyers of Western New York in December of 2016. Please give Ms. Murphy a warm welcome.
Thanks so much, Carisha. And you're in for a treat today. It's 2 hours of exciting times, and we get to start with ethics. Usually we save ethics for the end, and no. So you get a half an hour of ethics credits out of this, just in case you weren't familiar with that. I want to thank everybody. There are new faces, there are old faces, but thank you for coming, and we really appreciate your help. Why do we need your help? These pictures are representative of what's going on in our community. It's the face of poverty. There's extraordinary poverty right in our backyard. We've been able to sort of to have a real impact with low-income people facing homelessness in the Buffalo City Court since 1990. Bob Alardo started the Attorney of the Morning program, and it's been highly successful and replicated throughout the country. How many of you here today volunteer in the Attorney of the Morning program?
Currently or ever?
Currently, ever. Thanks, Patty. It's a tremendous program, and it's fast-paced. It gives young attorneys and old attorneys, new and old, seasoned veterans, whatever, great experience negotiating and litigating. Last year, we helped over 1,000 clients and close to 10,000 people who were facing homelessness through eviction, and that's over a quarter of our cases at Volunteer Lawyers Project. It's a really important program. People who are vulnerable, who are just desperate for help, we help them. We stabilize their lives, we preserve their home, and we avert some very significantly dire consequences for them. We give them hope and promise and restore some opportunity to their lives. I found this from the Community Action Organization. I typically talk about poverty in Buffalo, and we all know, I think, in this room that Buffalo is the 4th poorest large city in the country. It vacillates depending on the census data. It goes from 3 to 4 and whatever. It's really an abysmal statistic. In Buffalo, 30.5% of our residents live in poverty. 54% of children and 58% of children under 5 live in poverty. It's desperate times for people who live in the city. And if you think about it, the suburbs are not immune to poverty either. This is just a snapshot of what goes on. 15% of people living in the county of Erie live in poverty. While that number may not seem extraordinarily high, let me give you some numbers. In the city of Lackawanna, 4,349 people live in poverty. Those are all potential clients for Volunteer Lawyers Project and people you could help. In Blaisdell, 1,654 people live in poverty. In Tonawanda, 4,162 people live in poverty. In Williamsville, right? Even though they have a 5.5% poverty rate, that 5.5% translates to nearly 3,000 people. Again, those are potential clients that we can help prevent from homelessness. Living in poverty has some significant impacts on people. This next slide represents some information that the United Nations talked about. And when you first think about it, when people live in poverty, you think about people living in a third world country. You think about people who are denied choices and opportunities to participate. You think about lack of capacity to effectively, I'm sorry, take that back. You think about people not having enough food or clothes or shelter or electricity or water. Well, you know what? That's happening in our backyard. I've had clients who don't have electricity. I've had clients who have no food to put on their table. It's happening in the city of Buffalo. The crisis of the unrepresented. The crisis of the unrepresented, there's a great report from the Permanent Commission on Access to Justice. It happens every year. It started as a task force, and former Chief Judge Littman and current Chief Judge DeFiore are so committed to assisting low-income people, and particularly because unrepresented people in the courts creates havoc. It creates lost opportunities. The overall quality for justice suffers for everybody, whether you're represented or not. Think about those times when you've represented your clients and opposing party is not represented by counsel. It's extraordinarily difficult to negotiate a settlement with somebody who doesn't quite understand the legal standard, who doesn't understand the jargon, who doesn't understand how to talk with opposing counsel. In 2016, there were 6.12 million New Yorkers who lived below the poverty level. Out of that 6.12, 1.8 million had to navigate the civil legal services on their own. Now, we help. Civil legal services providers help. But there's only a finite number of dollars that provides for attorneys like me and people at Volunteer Lawyers Project in legal aid and neighborhood legal services to help those people. So last year, 908 cases were handled by our organizations. That doesn't come close to the 1.8 million. Who are we at Volunteer Lawyers Project? For those of you who know, thank you. If you know, it's just a really quick little update. We've been around for 35 years. Our executive director, Bob Alardo, founded us. We started as a project of Neighborhood Legal Services, and we were incorporated as a not-for-profit. We help thousands of people every year who are low-income people facing disastrous losses. And we recruit and train private attorneys to help our clients. A little snapshot, we are growing exponentially, which is due to Bob's leadership. We now have plus or minus 20 full-time staff attorneys in 2 offices. We have an office in Batavia now. We have about 10 support staff people, and we're growing. And our stats are pretty impressive. We always have around 400 volunteer attorneys. We're always looking for more. The translation of their services is over $1 million a year. And we have statewide and local award winners. And there's more statistics on that slide that's in your materials we gave you. Our case types, if you look, our most frequently occurring case that we help clients with is family law, followed by eviction defense. That's where we need your help, because last year we had, again, 1,185 eviction defense cases. This is one of my favorite sayings: to the world you may be one person, but to one person you may be the world. The impact you can have on one client's life is just extraordinary. And I'm sure that Josh can talk about that, because Josh Stubbs, who's a speaker later on, is one of our favorite volunteers who's been with us for a number of years. He takes on the most difficult cases, and he gets clients really, really unbelievably wonderful results. Benefits of volunteering. If you haven't volunteered at VLP, I'm sure we're all familiar with Rule 6.1, which is an aspirational rule which says that lawyers should provide 50 hours of pro bono legal services a year. 50 years, yes. We are committed to providing at least 50 years of pro bono legal services each. And in addition to that, if you look at Rule 6.1, it talks about a financial contribution to legal services organizations in the amount of at least 1 billable hour. It's nice. We always ask for more, but I ask for more. You contribute to the proud history of public service. Our bar is known for helping others, and we've continued that locally, nationally, and statewide. You gain valuable CLE credit and pro bono hours. We provide free CLE trainings in exchange for very modest time commitments. We provide malpractice insurance for those attorneys who are representing our clients. So when you either assist us through the helpline or at Attorney of the Morning or both, or handle another case, you are always covered by our malpractice insurance. We provide technical support, and what's really good for young lawyers is mentoring and networking. I know Josh has a limited amount of time to talk today, but you know, he did a whole lot of networking when he was a new attorney, and it got him to a great place today. So that is really why we need your help. Now, ethics is really exciting. The ethics of limited scope representation. When you are over at Attorney of the Morning program, or when you are helping a client through the Housing Helpline and providing legal advice and assistance through a phone, over the phone, it's a limited scope program. You have a very finite representation. And the question is, what rules do I have to follow? And I'm really concerned about conflicts. Conflicts are always big, particularly if you're not sitting in your office, if you're not able to access your conflicts checking system. So we're going to talk about that. But first and foremost, we're going to do just a really quick little primer of selected rules of professional conduct. I'm sure we're all familiar with Rule 1.6, which is confidentiality of information. So we all have a huge responsibility and duty to protect the confidential information that we obtain from our clients. Rule 1.7 is conflict of interest current clients. And that is, we shall not represent clients, we shall not, and the words in the rules are shall not represent clients if there is a client who has a similarly situated problem as what you've already represented a client on. And these selected rules are also in your materials. 1.8, current clients, specific conflict of interest rules. These are a little trickier, a little more novel, but they're essentially specific business transactions, gifts, and financial assistance. And then duties to former clients. We have an obligation to not represent clients and to keep our other client and our former clients' information confidential as well. And 1.10, imputation of conflicts of interest, which is really the critical part of the professional responsibility rules. And that is, your liability could be imputed to your firm. Correct, Bob? Right. Now, what happened was, we looked at the ABA model rule, because what does the ABA model rule say about your conflict of interest rules, and how does that intersect with providing limited scope representation? The ABA really wanted to make it easy and in the interest of justice for lawyers to be able to confidently represent clients who are low income on a pro bono basis without having to have their hands tied by the cumbersome conflict checking rules. So if you're out of your office and you're working in like a help desk program, before you meet with a client, before 2002, if you looked at Rule 1.10, it was reasonable to require you to call your office, to talk to someone in your office, to conduct a really cumbersome conflict check, and to wait and have people look, and did we represent this person, or is this person's, is there a conflict? We don't have to do that anymore, because what ABA said is we really want to encourage lawyers to assist low-income people, so we're going to relax the rules. And we're going to talk about those rules in a minute. And what's really critical is everybody is really concerned about, what if I go out and I'm working at a clinic and I don't call my office and I don't engage in that really detailed conflicts check? And what happens if I return to the office and there was a conflict? And what happens if I talked to somebody about a case and I didn't realize that we represented the opposing party, and that opposing party who we represented is a multi-million-dollar client of our firm? That could pose significant problems for you. So what the ABA said was, if you have actual knowledge of the conflict when you are at that limited scope program and you're talking to that client and you have actual knowledge that a conflict exists, you don't talk to that client anymore. If you don't have actual knowledge that there's a conflict never exists. But the ABA went one step further, and their analysis then went to what happens when you go back to the office. You have relaxed conflict rules when you are at that limited scope program, but what happens when you go back to the office and you discover that there was indeed a conflict? And so will that conflict be imputed to your firm? The model rule 6.5 comment 4 says no. There is no imputation of conflicts when you return to the firm. I know that that's really simplified because we only have 25 minutes to talk about conflicts. And Bob Alardo sits on the President's Pro Bono Access to Justice Committee for the State Bar, and they're going to be doing a lot of stuff with limited scope ethics. So stay tuned for that if you really want to hear the nitty-gritty details. Correct? New York, a few years after the ABA rule, said, wow, you know what? We've got a model rule, but, let's do our own rule. So New York basically writes the same rule as the ABA model rule. So that's great. If you're providing legal services, free legal services, under the auspices of a legal services organization, and you have no actual knowledge of a conflict, then a conflict doesn't exist. That's it. That's the rule. But What it didn't do was it didn't go as far as comment 4. There was no comment that said, when you return to the office, the conflict is not imputed to the firm. A couple years ago, when we started the Pro Se Assistance Program in federal court, and we talked to the lawyers about volunteering there, they were really concerned about the conflicts. And they were especially concerned about the fact that there was no comment 4 in the New York rules. And again, stakes are really high. You're in a large law firm. You don't want to talk to somebody, don't realize for whatever reason that there is a conflict, and then you could jeopardize your relationship with a current client. You don't want to do that. So what happened was again, because Bob is still in the back, and he could be talking about this because he does much better than I do. He decided that what we were going to do is we were going to submit a letter, an inquiry, to the New York State Bar Association Committee on Professional Ethics. And it was an extraordinarily detailed question, and it was written through with collaboration from people all across the state, with professors, with ethics experts, with attorneys from the area. And we got, in July 30th of 2014, we got a very detailed 5-page ethics opinion that talks about what are conflicts when you have a limited scope representation situation. That's in your materials, and it's really worth reading. What it really does is it clarifies ABA Model Rule 6.5 as well as the New York rule. And it makes it extraordinarily clear that a lawyer who represents a client in a limited pro bono legal services program owes a continuing duty of confidentiality to that client and is precluded from later representing a material adverse client in the same or substantially related matter if the lawyer has actual knowledge of the unwaived conflict. But conflicts arising from participation in such a program are not imputed to the lawyer's firm. I would recommend that you read that opinion. It's very instructive. It will make you feel very confident about walking outside of the office and talking to a client in a limited scope situation. There's a 4-step process involved. The first is you have to be participating in a limited scope legal assistance program. So you can't just be representing a paying client. You can't just take someone off the street. It has to be through the auspices of a legal services organization. Second is you have to have actual knowledge of the conflict. It's pretty evident. And we've had attorneys who have participated in our limited scope programs who start talking with a client who, when they begin the conversation, they are not aware of any conflict. But during that conversation, there is something that triggers that lawyer's memory that says, oh my God, I have a conflict. We work as a team with our attorneys, and if that happens, you let the VLP law student or paralegal or whoever's volunteering know that there's a conflict and you step away. We will end that consultation. You owe a continuing duty of confidentiality to that program client that you talk with. Even when you return to the firm, you owe a continuing duty of confidentiality to that client, no different than any other client that you would owe that same duty to. That means that you're precluded from subsequent representation of a material adverse client in the same or substantially the same situation. And most importantly is the program lawyer's conflict are not imputed to others in the law firm. So that's really the 4 steps that you need to consider when you're looking at the ethics of limited scope representation. So, knowing that, I have a couple of hypotheticals involving our mythical attorney, Josh Dubbs. Josh is volunteering at a housing helpline on December 19th. He's one of our first or second people who have signed up. He's a regular volunteer at AOM, but he's never volunteered at the hotline, so he thinks that's great. He speaks with a lovely woman named Jenny Smith, who served with eviction papers, and she's got to appear in Lackawanna City Court. The landlord is a guy named Edward Sheeran, but he's no relation to the singer. Josh talks with her. He advises her about what her rights are as a tenant, and he gives her additional advice about defenses. Both feel really good after the call ends. Josh feels that he's empowered the woman with enough legal advice that she's going to be okay on her own. And the client feels really good about showing up in court. Does Josh have a conflict in talking with Jenny Smith? How would we know if he had how would he know if he had a conflict?
Imagine after I find out who the landlord is, I'd have to know whether or not I've ever represented him before.
Okay, so while you're on the phone talking with Jenny Smith and she says Edward Sheeran is her landlord, what analysis do you have to go through?
Do I, as a solo practitioner, since I know all my, I can remember all my clients, I mean, do I recognize that name? Does that ring any bells? If it does, I have to go back into my, into a more comprehensive conflict check to see if Ed Sheeran ever comes up. If it does, I have to say, you're gonna have to speak to a different helpline person.
Sort of.
Sort of.
Sort of. You would do the conflict check in your mind. You would not have to go back to your office and do a conflict check. It just requires actual knowledge. So if you don't remember that you represented Ed Sheeran at that moment in time, there's no conflict.
But if that name rings a bell and I need to go back and double check?
Our advice always is if that name rings a bell, treat it as a conflict. Don't put yourself into a bad situation, and we'll take care of that for you. Does everybody understand that one? Okay. Sure.
Maybe I should be quiet for the next one, but would you ask if Ed is really the landlord or if it's a business entity that's owns the building?
You could. That's a very good question.
You could, I mean, yeah, you could make that inquiry and dig a little deeper into it for the sake of expediting, since you're supposed to avoid even the appearance. I might just move on to the next call because you never know, and you might have 30 other people waiting for you. So.
And that's really the same thing that you would do over at AOM as well, correct?
Definitely.
Okay. Does that answer your question? Okay. It's a week later. Josh is in his office talking with his new associate. The new associate, because you're really
because I'm big time now.
You're big time now. And your new associate tells you that she's super excited. She just signed Ed Sheeran as a client. Ed is a great property owner around Western New York with about 150 units. Are there any problems with that? Go ahead.
Only with Jenny Smith, because that was limited scope. So I represented Jenny Smith or gave her advice. So I probably would have to say you're gonna have to use somebody else to evict her, but I don't see any reason why I couldn't do the rest.
What does everybody think about that?
I need the business.
Yeah.
It's fine for the associate to represent Sheeran, but you should probably not.
And why is that?
Because having that limited scope representation of the client.
Okay. Anybody else want to add to that? Now, Josh might think it's okay, but according to Opinion 1012 and the rules of professional conduct, the associate does not have a conflict, but Josh does. And Josh owes a continuing duty of confidentiality to Jenny Smith, the program client. So, Josh, you really can't represent Ed.
Thanks, Jenny. That was big business for me.
Would you add anything to that, Bob?
Well, he would only be possibly precluded from representing Ed against Jenny. He can
Okay.
represent Ed in every other case.
Okay.
And the other thing is that the opinion is very clear. This is especially good for the larger firms. That when you go back to your office after the limited scope, that you're not directed to put that information about the limited scope clients into your conflicts database back in the firm. So it's even back in the firm, it's just what's in your head that matters as conflicts for you.
And again, the subtleties are included in that Opinion 1012, and we really don't have a lot of time today to go into the nitty-gritty details, but that's correct, Bob. Hypothetical 3, it's a year later. Josh is scheduled now to talk with a potential client today. His name is Ed Sheeran. Ed has seen Josh at Buffalo City Court, and he's so impressed with the way he handles evictions. He's watched Josh represent both tenants and landlords, and he wants Josh to represent him. Josh has a great meeting, and Ed gives him a huge retainer, and Josh thinks that's great because he's a solo practitioner with one associate. And it's the start of a beautiful relationship. Or is it?
Imagine to do the same answer as before.
Okay.
I'd have to back away for the same reasons that we were.
So a year later, do you think you're going to remember Jenny Smith? If you don't, so let's switch the facts a little. He has no recollection that he represented Jenny Smith on a 10-minute phone conversation a year prior. How does that impact your answer?
I'm not sure. No actual
Who?
knowledge.
Okay, so if Josh has no actual knowledge, does a conflict exist? The answer is no. So you can freely represent Ed Sheeran.
Take that big retainer.
Absolutely. But what happens if at some point in time Josh goes, uh-oh, I know this Ed Sheeran guy because he evicted my client. He attempted to evict my client, Jenny Smith, and I remember talking to Jenny Smith. So if those facts are there, how does that temper your answer now? Go ahead, Margot.
Well, I'm just thinking, can you make a note in the file that your firm, if Jenny Smith didn't get evicted because she did such good advice, and then he tries to evict her now, you got a problem. But if she's gone on with her life, you can't tell them. You've got confidentiality, so I'm like, can you make a note and just make sure you don't represent him against her?
Okay, let's step back. Does Josh take any files back to the office from his limited scope representation of Jenny Smith? Yes or no? Who thinks yes? Who thinks no? So if Josh has no file in the office and is really depending on his memory, does that change it? So he has no file and he has no entry in his conflict checking system that Jenny Smith ever existed. So if he doesn't remember, there is no conflict.
If he doesn't remember, but I thought you said he remembered.
But if he remembers, oh my God, I remember this Jenny Smith and I helped her. So how does that impact on your answer now?
If the name sounds familiar to me, that's usually when I take a step back and say, it's probably just best that I let somebody else handle that one.
Exactly. So he cannot represent Ed Sheeran if he attempts to evict Jenny Smith again. But can he represent Ed Sheeran in any other matters? Yes, any matter other than representing Jenny Smith. Does anybody have any questions about Josh's scenarios? You did really well. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm very ethical. I like it.
Yes.
Jenny Smith, presumably they entered into a stipulation and she stayed there. But at that time, Josh's representation is concluded. And so Mr. Shearing wants to bring a new action against Ms. Smith. Does the prior representation from a year past for 10 minutes preclude him from doing that?
Did everybody hear the question?
Yeah, but it's not on the team, so.
Okay, here's the question. Mr. Sheeran wants to evict Jenny Smith another time. Josh is right now is Mr. Sheeran's attorney. Can Josh represent Mr. Sheeran in that eviction against Jenny Smith? Is there a conflict? Yes or no?
If he remembers Jenny Smith, there is.
Exactly. Okay, so if he remembers Jenny Smith, there is. But if he doesn't remember Jenny Smith, is there or isn't there? Andrea? No. Bob, would you add? Oh, Patty.
Jenny remembers him.
Okay, well, there you go. Bob. Okay.
That would raise it if she says, wait, you represented me. But for a former client, the standard is it has to be, they have to have material adverse interest, which they would. And it has to be the same or substantially related.
Which is that?
Matter. So when you say the conflict exists, it means that it triggers the operation of the rule. And you would still look at the rule the same as you would at that point if it was a full service client. And maybe it precludes you, maybe it doesn't, depending upon your analysis of the whole rule about duties to former clients. It's just that the rules don't even apply unless it's triggered in your brain. But then you're right. You would still have to analyze: is this the same or substantially related matter where I'm concluding it, and is there any way then around it?
That was a good question. My time is up. I would urge you all to go look at Opinion 1012. It's a great opinion, and it will guide you in any questions you may have. And if you have questions about limited scope ethics, please feel free to give me an email, give me a call, call Bob. We're happy to help you out. Thanks so much. I am. Who goes first?
Me.
I have the pleasure of introducing our attorney, Josh Stubbs. How many of you in this room know Josh Stubbs? Oh, most of you do. Isn't that nice? You know what? Josh Stubbs is a solo attorney. We know that. And he does a lot of general practice, and he is extraordinarily good to Volunteer Lawyers Project. And we are so grateful for his service to our clients and his support of our program that he received our VIP award this year at our Champions for Justice Bash. And in addition to that, if you get the Buffalo Law Journal or saw it, he made the front page. You know, it's great. We're so pleased. And again, one of the things that we like to do at VLP for our volunteer attorneys is to make sure that they get credit where credit is due. And so when I was interviewed by Mike Canfield, who's the editor, and I talked about attorneys and law firms that helped us, I had no idea he was putting Josh on the cover, but that's really cool. You know, he's a great guy. He's committed to civil legal services for low-income people, and he's a really engaging and entertaining speaker. So without further ado, Josh. Do you have a PowerPoint?
No, we don't have a PowerPoint.
Okay.
You're just gonna have to listen to me drone on.
Thanks, Josh.
Thank you. That's quite a lot of pressure I'm under now. I'm really gonna have to perform here. So we predictably are now running behind, so we're gonna probably try and run through this fairly quickly. We're not gonna pause for questions. Hold your questions for the end if you would, please. And we're gonna kind of tag team. I'm gonna do the first couple, then Christine's gonna do, or I think we're gonna do a couple together, and then she's gonna do the last two. So. The first thing I want to say is when you're doing this sort of thing, a lot of times you're not looking to necessarily get what would you would consider in another typical litigation case to be the ultimate victory, okay, a dismissal of your case. You're not looking for judgment. You're not looking for, you know, a moral victory. A lot of times what you're doing is you're looking for defects in the paperwork so that you can basically you can talk the landlord or the landlord's attorney into giving you a better deal. I had an intern once say, well, that's a jurisdictional defect, so we should move to dismiss. I said, no, we're just gonna see if we can get them an extra couple weeks. And she said, no, why don't we just try and get it dismissed? I was like, that's paper law, but when you're doing stuff like this, you got to think about the practical aspects of it. And that's what you do as attorney of the morning. You know, if you go in there, you know, swinging, you might win, you might lose. A lot of times what the clients really want is just more time. You think that might not be a victory, but think of how fast could you pack up your house? Could you do it in 3 to 7 days? Could you do it in 3 weeks? Sometimes getting them the extra 2 weeks is plenty, and that's all the tenants really need. So particularly when you're talking about pro ses, and a lot of landlords do these things themselves because they think that they're lawyers, that's when you know that there's a good chance that there's something wrong with the paperwork, okay, except for the really experienced ones. So that's really the first thing that you can really look for. Now, if you're just on a helpline, you might have to ask the tenant to read the stuff to you. But if you can nitpick some of the stuff, you can usually tell them, well, you go, or the tenant can tell the landlord, well, I'm going to ask the magistrate to dismiss this unless you want to just work something out. So I put samples in here because when we did this a few months ago, the main criticism we got was we didn't have any samples that you guys could steal. So I put some samples in here, but there are problems with all of these. So we'll talk about the prerequisites. We'll start with the non-payment evictions. So the Real Property Actions and Proceedings Law and all these things are RPAPL Article 7, 711, 713, if you want to go and check out the actual statutes. But for a non-payment, okay, there has to be a demand. for the rent prior to the eviction. Okay, you can't just assume that your tenant should know that they're late in the rent. So there has to be something. Now, technically, it can be verbal. When I represent landlords, I don't do verbal because how do you prove it? Written is certainly much better to prove. So I gave you guys a sample of a 3-day notice. Now, with the tenants, you have to get a little more specific because sometimes they don't realize it. This is a 3-day notice to pay or quit, but if they've already gone to court and they've already been evicted, the marshals will serve them a 72-hour notice to vacate. They also call that a 3-day notice. So they say, well, I got a 3-day notice. Well, which one is it? Have you already gone to court or not? Now, here's the thing that a lot of landlords do wrong. Okay, they don't specify. Just say you're late. Okay, you owe $1,200 for October and November. And if you don't pay it in 3 days, I'm going to evict you. That's not good enough. This 3-day notice is deficient because it does not specify what that $1,200 is for. Is it $100 for October and $1,100 for November? Is it $600 each? That's not good enough. That is a jurisdictional defect. And that can get the whole case dismissed. Okay. Holdover evictions are a little bit different. Okay. Now, holdover evictions are a little more general because you don't have to give somebody a reason, but in exchange for not having to give them a reason, you have to give them more time. So you have to give them one full rental period. Okay, and you give them a notice to terminate, and that full rental period will start on the next month, the first of the next month. So I dated this November 1st, and we'll presume for argument's sake that I served this on the tenant on November 1st. Now, you'll notice when we get to the petitions, notice that I brought this before the end of November. I served this during the month of November, so the 30 days doesn't start ticking until the next month, until December 1st. A lot of landlords, particularly the pro ses, think to themselves, well, I gave them 30-day notices and I served my papers on day 31. And you have to go back and say, nope, doesn't work that way. You have to give them a full rental period. So this is, okay, well, here's the other thing too. You don't have to give reasons. But here's, in my 30-day notice that I have for you guys, I give a reason. Why did I put that in there? Well, if you give a reason, then you've just created an issue of fact that if the tenant really wants, the tenant can ask for a hearing, and then your landlord is going to have to prove that. So that's another thing that you can potentially get your landlord on. Well, I can have the hearing, and you're going to have to bring proof that you've been smoking marijuana, and it's been permeating the apartment. That means witnesses, that means testimony, that means the whole like. That usually means an adjournment. Could mean actually going in front of the judge instead of in front of the hearing officer. So in the event you see on the 30-day notice, if they say, well, it's because your dogs are barking, or you can also say if it's because your kids are too loud. That's a violation of it's the FMLA, yeah, the Fair Housing Codes too. Or because you're on Section 8. Okay, that's also a city violation, and Judge Carney not a fan of people that do that. So you can beat up on your landlord pretty well doing that. Typically, you'll see with the more experienced landlords or when there's attorneys involved, it'll just say, we're terminating your tenancy because we want to move on and we want to engage in a tenancy with a new tenant. Unfortunately, that's not really a reason, so there's nothing to prove there. So you have to go with other possible defects. So talking about the pleading requirements, again, it depends on why. Okay. Also, service does have to be effectuated. When I represent a landlord, I always nail and mail, even the pre-notices, because then you have an affidavit. A lot of times, the landlord will just say it, okay, and now you can say, well, let's have everybody come back in and talk about it. And a lot of times, landlords just want them to be out, just want the tenant to be out, so they're willing to make a deal. There's one other thing that I talk about in the general filing and pleading requirements. I didn't give you guys a sample of this in the papers, but there is such a thing as a licensee eviction. That's under RPAPL 713. That's more commonly known as a squatter eviction. People for which there is no landlord-tenant relationship, you give them a 10-day notice. Another thing too, now it's not common, will they be handling Section 8 on the helpline? No? Okay. Well, then I'll talk about it anyway. If somebody says, I am a Section 8 recipient, that's not including county assistance, welfare, things like that. We're talking about federal subsidized Section 8, Rental Assistance Corporation, Belmont. One of the questions you're going to want to ask is, what's your court date? If the answer to that question is anything but Tuesday or Thursday, which is the day that Neighborhood Legal Services is there, say no problem, go to your court date, Neighborhood Legal Services will be there. You go to their court date and have them adjourn it to a day when Neighborhood Legal Services will be there, and Neighborhood Legal Services will take care of that.
In Buffalo.
In Buffalo, yes, I'm sorry. Only in Buffalo. Service. The requirements of service, well, there's several ways to do it, okay? You got personal service, that's pretty obvious. Bam, you're served. The pros to that for landlords is that you get 100% jurisdiction. So even if the tenant doesn't show up, they can get a money judgment, okay? You can do a leave-in mail. That's the suitable age and discretion. You guys probably remember this stuff. If any of you don't do litigation, you remember this stuff from your New York practice classes. That can give you personal service against one if there's multiple tenants, but you won't get it against the other one. That is considered substitute service against anybody that you're not personally serving. And then you got nail and mail. Stick it to the door with duct tape, mail regular and certified. It's easier for landlords to do that, okay, but you don't get a money judgment. So if if the landlord really wants blood, then you can they can do that. Or they can just have the marshals and the sheriffs do that. That's something that your pro ses will typically do. Okay, a lot of attorneys will use process servers or do it themselves. I do it myself personally, but sometimes they'll use the marshals. They will just stick it to the door and mail it. They don't screw around with trying to personally serve somebody. So ask the tenant when they call in, how did you get the papers? Okay, why do you ask that? Well, if they say, well, it was stuck to my door, well, when's your court date? It's Monday. Well, how much time do you need? Well, I can be out by the end of the week. Well, you're not going to get a money judgment, so you're going to get a default warrant of eviction. The marshals or the sheriffs probably won't be there before Friday, so you know what? Just leave. Just go ahead and get out. Don't worry about it. Don't need to deal with it at all. If they did get it personally, okay, you're going to want to tell them that they should probably show up, because otherwise they'll get a money judgment against them. Another thing you want to look at, who actually owns the property? So in my sample petitions here, I own the property. But do I? Is it the name of an LLC? Am I doing it on behalf of a family member? Am I just the power of attorney? Okay, that's the kind of thing that you can work on too. If the petition does not name the actual owner of the property, that is also a jurisdictional defect. Okay, if it's actually Joshua Dubs LLC, but I say Joshua E. Dubs personally, that's no good, okay, and you can use that as leverage to get a better deal. Guess we don't need to really go over how to do it against corporates, because this would be the helpline. But I guess I can talk about it briefly. If you are handling an eviction defense in person, another thing you want to look at is who's actually there. If the landlord is not represented by an attorney, or it is not the landlord him or herself, is it a family member? Is it somebody that's an agent? Okay, is it a corporate director or a member of the LLC or anything like that? Only attorneys can represent companies. Only attorneys, or people who have passed the bar and been admitted in this state, or who have pro-hocked in, can represent anybody that is not representing themselves. So you see this all the time. I'm here for my father. Why is your father here? He can't come to court. He's infirm. Well, if he's not here, I'm going to move to dismiss. Unless your father wants to make a deal. I mean, if you can give me 3 weeks, we can settle this right now. That's the kind of things that you do. You find the weaknesses in the case, and then you try to get them something better. And if you're advising the tenant on that, you can go through the checklist to see if there's anything that you can nitpick, and that you can tell them to go in there and tell the judge this, and this, and that's why I should get a better deal. So I'll turn it over to Christine to start with defenses. Do you want these? Or? No.
Thank you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Christine. I'm a staff attorney at Neighborhood Legal Services in the housing unit. I just want to do a disclaimer, or a little plug, I guess, before I get into this. So, because when you're staffing the helpline, if somebody mentions Section 8, like Josh says, or they mention a subsidy, they say their rent is $204, something like that, where you're like, maybe somebody else is helping them pay. You can refer them to Neighborhood Legal Services, because we are staff attorneys that have experience in the subsidies, in the regulations, and a lot of the subsidized cases are really complicated, and you're not going to be able to advise them on a call on a helpline. You're going to have multiple hours in advising and investigating. So if you hear when you're on the helpline Section 8, subsidy, something like that, that should trigger you to then say, you know what, here's the phone number for Neighborhood Legal Services, give them a call, they specialize in subsidies. And that way you're not spending time that you can be assisting other people, because you're not going to actually be able to fully assist them with their subsidized problem. So I just wanted to say that. And the other thing is, as Josh said, on Tuesdays and Thursdays in Buffalo, we are at Buffalo City Court. But if most of the cases on the helpline, I think, are outside of the city of Buffalo. So if you get a call from outside the city of Buffalo, we do take cases for out-of-town court, so that if it becomes a case where you don't think your advice is going to be enough, that this person really has issues that probably would be better served with an attorney by their side, you can always advise them to call Neighborhood Legal Services as well, because we may be able to actually go with them, and that would be beyond your scope as a helpline attorney. So you can just keep that in mind when you are assisting people on the helpline. So the defenses, and all of these things in the materials are meant to kind of trigger you. So when you're on the phone, these things should be somewhere in your mind where you're like, oh yeah, I know there was something about, service. I know there was something about this, that, and the other thing. So you can definitely read through these materials. We're going kind of fast, and we will take questions at the end. But again, service must be completed between 5 and 12 days prior to the court date. So if you're taking a call and they say, yes, I got court papers yesterday and court's tomorrow, there's an issue there. So you're going to want to advise them they should appear at court. They should tell the judge they just received the court papers, the day before, a couple days before court, something like that. Because then that will trigger the judge to look into the affidavit of service and the service issues further. So in that case, you will want to advise the person about the law that the court papers have to be served at least 5 days before the court date. But really your goal is to get them enough information that they feel comfortable and empowered to tell the judge that, so that then that triggers the judge to know, okay, I need to look into this further. Because unfortunately on the helpline, you're not gonna be able to go into all the law and all the intricacies with the tenant, and that's also not really gonna help them, because they're gonna be more confused than when they called you. Your goal is to empower them to be able to represent themselves. So you're just going to stick to the basics and say, well, you received it earlier than 5 days before the court date, so let the judge know that first thing. Before we go on to the other defenses, the other tip I have is you're going to want to let the tenants know that they should start with their strongest defense. So especially in the out-of-town courts, they don't get very much time to talk. I will say that's a difference between the City of Buffalo landlord-tenant court and a lot of the out-of-town courts. City of Buffalo court, evictions are every day. The judges are well aware of all the defenses, and a lot of times they'll let the tenant talk or let the tenant speak. In the out-of-town courts, sometimes it moves very fast, and they don't have a lot of time to go through the entire story. So you're going to want to let everybody know that they should, if they have this defense, that's the first thing that you should be saying before you get into how the landlord is wrong and all the other things they want to say. They should say, I got the court papers 2 days ago. And that way, that'll trigger everything for, hopefully, to then help them get the case dismissed, or maybe just get them time if that's what they're looking for. So again, it has to be served either personally, suitable agent discretion, or nail and mail. So, our tenants don't know what that means. So you just simply ask them, how did you receive your court papers? And if they did receive it on their door, you're going to then follow up with, did you receive a certified mail copy? Regular mail copy as well, but of course regular mail is hard to prove whether it was sent, whether it was received. So certified mail is usually the trigger to see whether they followed up with mailings. And if they say no, then always follow up with, you might want to check with your post office because you might have it sitting there, because the post office just leaves a little post-it note. And that sometimes gets lost, blows away, whatever. So the person honestly might not have received the certified mail copy, but the landlord sent it, and just checking with their post office, it can kind of alleviate that from them thinking that they actually do have a defense. So if the person says, no, I didn't receive a certified mail copy, you don't want to jump right to, well, that's your defense, and let the judge know that. You do want to make them aware of it, but you want to tell them to check first. Okay. As Josh said, the named petitioner must be the owner. A lot of times the tenant's not going to know who the legal owner is. So an easy way to check is for them to call the assessor's office in whatever town they are in. And they can do that themselves. They just have to give the address, and they can let them know who the owner is. You can also give them the website if they have internet access, and they can check the Erie County Real Property Parcel Search and see who the owner is. And that way they have that, because they might, always deal with so-and-so and they think that's the landlord, but this is actually the owner, and you want to make sure that's the person that's named in the petition. Again, subsidized status must be included in the petition, but if you see that or if they mention that, refer them to Neighborhood Legal Services. If a tenant has already moved out and handed in the keys, then they've already given up possession, so the eviction proceedings are moot. So if they say, well, I got the papers last week, I've moved out, court is Friday, you want to follow up. Did you give the landlord the keys? Does the landlord know that you moved out? A lot of tenants say, well, they're the ones that gave me the court papers. Of course they know I moved out, but they didn't actually tell the landlord that they've moved out. So you're going to want to follow up with that. And if they haven't yet given the landlord the keys, they should do that before court and get some sort of proof of that, because that then should render the case moot and get it dismissed that way. And if the tenant is being brought to court for non-payment of rent, but they had paid all of the rent arrears prior to the court date, or if they have all the rent arrears to bring to court, that will be a defense. So if they say, I received court papers on Monday and I paid everything today and my court date is Friday, then you can advise them. So they still should go to court to show the judge, to tell the judge that they did pay everything, because you don't want to rely on the landlord telling the judge that. And they should have proof of payment. But you can advise them that, payment is a defense and that they should go to court, because a lot of tenants think, well, I paid it, so I'm fine. And of course, for, upstanding landlords, that's the case, that they're fine. But there's some landlords that won't let the judge know that if the tenant's not there. So you want to make sure that you don't just say, well, then you don't have to go to court. They still should go, but that, again, empowering them, letting them know, well, that is a defense. If you've paid everything and you have proof, show the judge and you should be okay. Okay, so the next topic, unfortunately, we could do a whole CLE on this topic alone, so I'm going to have to move super quickly, and I'm not going to go through everything that's in the materials, but a huge problem in Erie County and all over the country right now are bad housing conditions. So the warranty of habitability is in the real property law, section 235B, and landlords, every landlord has an obligation to obviously keep their property habitable if they're going to rent it out. That's why you're getting rent. So a lot of people probably will be calling the helpline saying, I have bad conditions. I have no electricity. The heat's not working, especially now that we're getting into winter. A huge problem in the winter is always that the pipes freeze and then they burst. Things like that. So when somebody is calling you about those conditions, or talking to you about those conditions, there's a lot that you really need to know before you can advise them. So number one, have they told the landlord? And you think that's a very simple, obvious point. But a lot of times, again, tenants assume the landlord should know, even if they haven't told them. So make sure that they've told the landlord about the problem. Has the landlord actually taken reasonable steps to try and fix the problem? So if the tenant says, well, I'm calling because my pipes burst. Okay, when did they burst? This morning. Okay, well, did you tell the landlord? Yeah, I told them an hour ago. We've dealt with this. So, you have to give the landlord a reasonable amount of time to actually fix it. The warranty of habitability is not necessarily a defense to say, I have a problem with my apartment, but it's, I have a problem with my apartment and the landlord's not doing anything about it. And that's the difference. So you're going to want to ask if they have told the landlord. You're going to ask if the landlord's done anything about it. You're going to ask what proof they have of the conditions. And if they don't have proof yet, have they contacted the city inspectors or the town inspectors or the health department? And if not, you can refer them to those agencies so that they can come out and look at the problem. And another issue with this is rent. So as long as they are not a subsidized tenant, they're a private tenant, they do have the ability to withhold their rent. But withhold their rent, so they cannot spend the rent. And that's, on the helpline, that'll be your job to advise them that they need to keep that rent. Because if they are brought to court, then, or if they are calling because they're being brought to court and they're saying, I have all these conditions, that's why I haven't paid the rent, the big question is, well, do you have it? Because if they don't have any of the rent money available, it's going to be pretty much impossible to use the warranty of habitability in the intended purpose of showing that I'm not paying the rent because of these conditions, and that's the only reason why I didn't pay the rent. So you can look through the materials, you can go through the law. I have some sites there, definitely take a look at that. This is not a super complicated area, but it is very technical, and you need to have all the steps. And a huge disservice to, I think, a lot of people is that, they heard so-and-so said, oh, just don't pay your rent. You don't have to pay rent because your ceiling fell down, or, you're not going to have to pay anything, or, I can hire my relative who does this kind of work, who's an electrician, but maybe isn't a licensed electrician. And so because I had to pay him, I don't have to pay the rent, things like that. There's a lot of myths out there about this. So you definitely want to advise people about what the actual warranty of habitability is in a way that they can understand, so that they can take the proper steps. Or if they're already at the point where they have court, then they aren't wasting their time or having false hope if they haven't met any of these things, and they just think, I'm going to go to court and I'm going to get it dismissed because I have bad conditions, and they don't know anything about how that actually happens. So just keep that in mind, because that happens a lot. And then once they're at court and the judge says, well, do you have the money? No. Did you tell and the landlord says, I didn't know that was happening. Okay, you're evicted, and people are shocked that can happen because they think it's not fair, but you have to advise them about what the law actually means. So another big thing with warranty of habitability, what conditions or what issues are considered under the warranty of habitability. So they have to be conditions that affect your life, health, or safety. So paint on the walls, dirty carpet, knobs that aren't really working on the kitchen cabinets, things like that. They're not going to be considered a violation of the warranty of habitability. So you have to kind of parse that out as well when you're talking to somebody on the helpline about what conditions they're facing. So I've listed some examples, but this definitely isn't an exhaustive list. So just that is the standard, is whether it affects their life, health, or safety. So depending on what conditions they're telling you, you can then advise them if that probably does qualify or doesn't qualify. Or if they give you a whole long list and they're listing, 20 things, you can help them pick out what actually would qualify and tell them focus on these things. So, some people are focusing on the wrong issues and saying, the paint, it needs to be painted, it hasn't been painted in 20 years, and they also are having really severe problems with their electric. And you want to get them to focus on the electric in front of the judge and not talk about the paint, because that is their issue. One thing you have to be aware of when you're giving advice, especially over the phone, is if it is an apartment that has conditions that are so bad that it really is uninhabitable completely, the judge can order them to vacate. So it wouldn't be an eviction, but the judge can essentially condemn the building and say, you got to get out because, landlord, you can't rent this to anybody. This needs to be fixed. And a lot of people don't think about that, and you have to make sure you're advising people. And I advise everybody of this, but especially when they are listing conditions that are very bad, and now that we are getting into winter, if they are talking about no heat. I mean, if you're standing there in front of the judge and saying, I don't have heat, the judge probably isn't going to then let you stay unless the landlord is going to be fixing it in a day or two or something like that. But if it's a broken furnace and the landlord doesn't have money to fix it and this whole thing, the judge isn't going to allow the person to stay. The other thing to be aware of too, and I don't know if I put this in here, but if the person has children, they have to be aware they are in open court, and if they are testifying to the judge under oath about all these horrible conditions in their apartment that they live in with their children, CPS may be an issue. So they just need to keep that in mind. If they're trying to stay in an apartment that is like that, they may be better served to just take any money they have withheld and move. And maybe your goal in that case is to get them as much time as possible, whether you're at attorney in the morning or if you're advising them on the helpline, to tell them, at this point you probably are going to focus on asking the judge for as much time as possible. But again, the judge isn't going to give you 30 days to move if it's very, very bad conditions. You're looking at, a short window of time, but maybe more than the 72 hours. While we're on that subject of the 72 hours, I do want to make a point that in the city of Buffalo, the way we calculate the 72-hour notice period after court is different than in the towns. So if you're working in the helpline, the best standard to use when you're advising somebody is that it may actually be 72 hours. So we get kind of used to the fact that in the city of Buffalo, it's about 7 to 10 days, and that's what the court actually advises people. But in the towns, depending on who they use. Now, if they use the Erie County Sheriffs, it usually tends to be longer. But if the town has a constable, which Cheektowaga does, I believe Tonawanda does, West Seneca. So when they have constables, I think Lackawanna uses their own marshals. So they usually could get the notice exact same day as court, and it's exactly 72 hours to move. So your best bet on the helpline is to advise people that if they are evicted and they do get the notice, they can check with whoever the officer is. Usually, a lot of times they'll put it right on the notice, or if it's the sheriffs, they can usually call the sheriffs and say, when are you coming back out? But it may be as little as actually 3 days. So just keep that in mind as well, because it is different than the city. Okay, so I'm just gonna move on from warranty availability. Like I said, I could do a whole training on that, and we just don't have the time today. So happens every so often. Under the RPAPL 711.5, a special proceeding may be maintained, and they use a very outdated term, but they call it the body house, and they actually still use that term. So basically what this is if a landlord is evicting a tenant based on illegal activity. Now, if they actually are using 711.5 in the petition, then the illegal use must be continuous. It cannot be a one-time occurrence, and that is in the case that I cite, and also just if you look into this a little further, if the landlord says, there was this one, like you were arrested for possession this one day, that doesn't actually fall under 711.5. Now, it may fall under a regular holdover, but it's not going to be this particular section. Illegal use is a continuous use of the apartment for illegal activity. Another thing to be aware of, and this is with Josh's lovely eviction of myself in the materials, is pay attention to what the illegal use is. So it actually has to be a crime, criminal activity. So if somebody is arrested for marijuana and it's a violation, that doesn't count. So that wouldn't actually be under this section. So keep in mind, or any other violation. Okay, so this next section I think is very, very important for anybody who's helping with the helpline. It is important for AOM too. But with the helpline, a lot of people, especially outside the city, don't know that they qualify for these services. So if somebody is, it looks like they don't maybe have a defense, or even if they have a defense, they're looking for extra time to move, they may be eligible for assistance through the Erie County Department of Social Services for emergency rent assistance, emergency moving assistance, storage assistance, and shelter. So first, talking about the rent, if somebody says, I haven't paid my rent, I lost my job, I'm 2 months behind, then your job as the helpline person can be to refer them to social services to apply for rent arrears. Social services may be able to assist them with paying that rent, which then, if the landlord accepts, stops any sort of eviction. So a few things to remember about this assistance is that, and this is for all of Erie County, so even though they have to apply at the Rath Building, or sorry, not at the Rath Building, at 478 Main Street, it applies to all of Erie County. So they, as long as they haven't received the assistance in the last 5 years, because you can only receive this assistance once every 5 years. So as long as they haven't received it before in the last 5 years, as long as they don't currently owe social services money, because that may be a cause for denial, and as long as it appears that they can afford the rent going forward. So that's the one that a lot of times people get denied for, because for instance, if they lost their job and they have zero income, they're not going to be able to afford a $600 apartment going forward without any income. So social services isn't going to pay $1,200 to then get them behind the next month and get evicted and just push it off. So the goal of the rent arrears assistance is to prevent eviction, not just to delay. So if it's a case where maybe somebody lost a job but they have a new job and they just got behind, or they got sick and they were out of work for 2 weeks or something like that, but they're going to be able to afford their apartment going forward, and they qualify for social services income guidelines. The income guidelines for social services for all of this assistance is 125% of the federal poverty income guidelines. Not sure if they're going to have that when they're on the helpline. So you'll have those numbers when you are talking to somebody. But if there's any ambiguity, sorry, I can't talk, then you're going to just tell them to apply, but they may or may not be eligible depending on their income. So they have to bring their proof of income. So, but that might be a huge help, because a lot of people aren't aware of that assistance, and that may prevent their eviction. Now, the other thing to be aware of is it is optional for the landlord to accept it. So when they are applying for the rent arrears assistance, the landlord does not have to accept it. This is not a case where the landlord has no choice. They do have a choice to accept this or not. So if the landlord says, no, I'm not going to take what they receive is a letter. It's called a letter of guarantee. And it's a letter from social services saying we will pay this amount, but then they send the check later. So they don't have to accept that. The landlord can choose not to, or the landlord can choose to accept it. However, if they do choose to accept it and they sign it and send it back to social services, it actually is a contract. It says, if this will prevent the eviction, sign here and send this back. So if the landlord has accepted that or signed it, they can then not move forward with the eviction. So again, on the helpline, if somebody says, I got behind, I got help from social services last week, landlord took it, sent it back in, but I have court on Friday, that would be a defense, because the landlord cannot proceed with the eviction while also accepting social services money, obviously. So keep that in mind. But if somebody is moving, they can take advantage of the moving and storage assistance. So there is a process with this, and you'll probably have this information, I think, when you're on the helpline, or you can refer them to 478 Main Street to get the information. But they may be able to have social services pay for their movers to move their stuff either into storage or to their new apartment. And this is an emergency benefit, so this only occurs for a certain list of reasons. It's not for everyone and every move, but eviction is one of the emergency reasons. So What they have to do is they have to get estimates from at least 2 moving companies that are on social services list, which again, you can refer them to 478, or you may have those materials as well. And they have to bring those estimates down to social services along with proof that they qualify. So an eviction notice, a 72-hour notice after court, or the notice of petition, or even a pay or quit notice or a 30-day you have to get out would qualify. So they can apply for the moving assistance, and that helps people because sometimes, you know, people realize they can't stay in the apartment for whatever reason, but they don't know what to do. So they're calling the helpline because I know I have to get out. I'm not looking to stay, but how am I going to move all my stuff? I don't have anywhere to go, all of that. So that's why this is so important, because even just advising them of the emergency benefits they may qualify for sometimes does help them and empower them, even if you're not able to help them because there is no defense, everything's done correctly, you know, there's nothing you can do to stop this. A lot of times just giving them this information helps them as well, because then they at least have a plan. And excuse me, the other thing is if they don't have anywhere to go and they will be evicted, they can apply for shelter. So they do have to go down to 478 Main Street, and they can, for shelter, they would go to the Rath building, and they would apply for emergency shelter once they are evicted. So another thing to remember is if somebody is on SSI, they may be able to receive that emergency rent assistance once every 12 months instead of once every 5 years. So that should trigger you. If somebody's on SSI, you know, they may be able to take advantage of that help sooner than somebody that can only get it once every 5 years. And that might assist with the eviction as well. So I won't go over. So another thing to let you know, another plug for NLS, is if somebody has problems with any of that with social services, our office assists with that. So let them know, here's all the information about how to apply, but if you have any problems with that, you can contact Neighborhood Legal Services, and they can assist with that. So how much time are we at?
About 15 minutes.
15 minutes? Okay. So I'm going to open it up to questions because we can go back. I know I went really, really fast. So why don't we do questions now so that, because I'm sure people have them. Yes, Stephen?
For the emergency benefits, does the recipient, is there any requirement that they pay back any money?
So it depends. So that's a good question. So if they are on SSI, generally no. If they are working, but they still qualify for the assistance, generally they will have to pay it back, but social services usually does a very small amount every month, a long-term payment plan to pay it back. The best answer is not to advise them of whether they would have to pay it back or not. Just let them know they may have to pay it back, they may not, but social services will tell them if they have to. Any other questions? Yes. Yes. So they should call the court themselves, and they should let the court know. Depending on the reason and depending on the court, they may get an adjournment. But you have to let them know that it's up to the court. So if they can't make court and the court doesn't give them an adjournment, you can definitely check with them how they received their court papers. Because if they weren't personally served, if they received mail service, at least you can advise them that if they don't appear, most likely they will not get a money judgment against them from the judge. They could get a 72-hour notice. If they're not there, most likely they're going to get an eviction because they're not there to present any defenses. I always say most likely because if the judge reviews the paperwork and sees a technical defense themselves, you never know. They may, but that's few and far between, that they may dismiss it just seeing that all the papers aren't in order. So just let them know that, but if they were personally served, then you just advise them they could be facing the eviction and a money judgment if it's non-payment case. And then you would just, if they don't get the adjournment and they don't appear, nobody can appear for them. They have to appear. Now, if there's multiple people in the household, whoever can appear should. Because whoever does appear could maybe get a deal or present the defense, and that'll affect the whole household. So let's say it's a husband and wife, and husband can't go, but wife can, that's fine. But if nobody can go for the household, or it's a single person, then they would have to ask for an adjournment, and they would have to ask that themselves from the court. Yes?
If a person is evicted and they're unable to take out all of their belongings from the apartment,
Yes.
what are the responsibilities of the landlord? How long is a landlord supposed to keep that property?
Yep. So the question is, after an eviction, how long does the landlord have to keep the property? What are the responsibilities of the landlord after an eviction with the personal property of the tenant? So under the law, the landlord has to give the tenant a reasonable amount of time to remove their belongings, as long as the belongings aren't abandoned. So we always tell tenants, and you should always tell tenants, that they should let the landlord know if they're not able to get everything out. They should try, because it's always easier to get it out before the eviction happens. But if they can't, they have to let the landlord know, I'm making arrangements and I'll be back. But the standard in the law says a reasonable amount of time. So the law actually doesn't give a time frame, but generally the courts have said it's about 30 days. But the 30 days is not in the law. So a lot of people think it's actually 30 days no matter what, and that's not always the case. So you can imagine two different scenarios. If you have somebody who's being evicted for non-payment of rent, and they got a 3-day pay or quit notice, and then court, and then they get a 3-day notice to move, maybe they get the 30 days. But if somebody gets a 90-day notice to vacate, then it goes to court, and then gets a 72-hour notice, maybe they don't get the full 30 days because they've known for 90 days that they have to move, and then court and all of that. So if they've known for 4 months that they've had to move, and that's documented in the court later, if the landlord does remove their belongings, might say, you had a reasonable amount of time to get this stuff out. So the actual standard is reasonable amount of time. So we're very careful about not telling people, you definitely have 30 days to get your stuff out. Soon as possible is always better, but reasonable amount of time. So I don't think in any circumstance 3 or 4 days is reasonable, and I don't think a court would say 3 or 4 days is reasonable. But when you start getting into 2-3 weeks, there's where the gray area. So does anybody else have any questions? Yes. Yes. So getting them back or getting them? Okay. So if somebody calls about a security deposit, they have to go to small claims court, is the general rule. So I'll talk about that, but that's going to be our answer. So the landlord, after they've moved, the landlord does have a reasonable amount of time to give the tenant back their security deposit. Usually that is 30 days. So a lot of times people will call and say, I moved yesterday and they didn't give me my security deposit back. So you have to tell them they have to wait. They should wait 30 days. If the landlord then doesn't return it, they can sue in small claims court. Now, small claims court is in every town court. It's just the same court. Or anybody in Erie County can sue in Buffalo City Court, small claims court. So the advantage of Buffalo small claims court is that depending on the town and depending on who the landlord is, sometimes it's nice to get out of that town to bring such an action where the judge doesn't know this landlord isn't there every week for all the evictions, things like that. So sometimes we tell people it depends on their circumstances. If they're not able to come into the city to come to court and all of that, they might want to do it in their town, but they have the option. So that's important to tell them. And it only costs, I believe, $20 or less to file the small claims action. So it does not cost a lot, and they do not need an attorney. So the civil legal services agencies do not generally help with small claims court because it's meant for pro se litigants, and because of priorities, obviously, defending evictions and things like that, we just don't have the resources to assist with small claims in most cases. So you just advise them to wait the 30 days. They can sue the landlord. Now, the landlord has to have a New York State address. So if the landlord is an out-of-state landlord or out-of-the-country landlord, they're going to have issues and they're not going to be able to sue in small claims. That's when then they would have to get an attorney, and at that point, the cost of an attorney versus the cost of the security deposit probably isn't going to be worth it for them unless they have a lot of other claims against the landlord. So at that point, it's probably going to be best to move on, unfortunately. but you should let them know if the landlord isn't in state, they shouldn't go ahead and file in small claims because they're not going to be able to have jurisdiction.
Can I add something to that?
Yeah.
Two other things about going to small claims court. You're going to want to make sure that you tell the tenant to make sure that they're suing the right party. Okay, the owner of the property. I've actually defended landlords because their management company gets sued. Can't sue the management company. You have to go after the landlord, him or herself, or the company if it's an LLC. The other thing you want to make sure when you're telling the tenant to calculate whether or not it's a good idea or not, that the landlord also then has a right to turn around and countersue for any rent that he or she feels is owed. So you have to tell the tenant to balance that, because if they say, well, I want to go after my $600 security deposit, but they got out of the eviction without a money judgment for the $3,000 that the landlord says they owe, the landlord can and most likely will countersue for the $3,000. So that shouldn't be a deterrent, but it should be something that they should be told, and so they can think about that when they're deciding, do I want to do that or not?
Yeah, I always tell tenants, you know, do you think the landlord has any reason to countersue you for anything, rent, damages, anything like that? Leave it up to them, but they can kind of make that analysis and exactly. If I say if you think you owe the landlord more than they owe you, leave it alone. Now, if the landlord brings them to court, to small claims, to sue for the rent, then obviously the tenant can then countersue for the security to just reduce the amount. Yes.
3 in outside the city of Buffalo and 5 in Buffalo?
It is. So the city of Buffalo, the limit that they can sue for is $5,000, and outside the city of Buffalo, it's $3,000.
Also, the city of Tonawanda and the city of Lackawanna. City courts, $5,000 jurisdictional.
Yeah.
It's the same in Lockport and North Tonawanda and Niagara Falls too.
Okay. Yeah, Creature.
What's the 72-hour warrant? How does it work with weekends and holidays?
Yes, so the law says with a 72-hour notice after court, the actual notice of eviction, weekends and holidays do not count as far as counting the 72 hours. So if you're actually calculating when the 72 hours is up, you skip the weekend or the holiday. However, if the time is up and you're finding like when will the person actually be evicted, in some towns they will come out on Saturdays. So if the time is up on Friday, sometimes they will evict on a Saturday. But if they receive the notice on Friday, you don't then count Saturday and Sunday. You skip to Monday. So I hope that makes sense. But you don't count weekends and holidays when you're counting the time. But if the time is up, they may be able to come out on a Saturday. In the city of Buffalo, they never come out on the weekends. But in the towns, again, especially with their own constables, own marshals, they have been known to come out on Saturdays. Usually not Sundays. Yes. Yes. So the question is, with warranty of habitability, can you sue for money you've already paid? And yes, you can. So the standard in warranty of habitability is for the period in which the conditions existed. So if you had the conditions and you can prove it, and you can prove the landlord knew about it for 6 months, and you paid the last 5 months and you only withheld this month, you can then sue for a rent abatement for the whole 6-month period. And that's important because if the landlord is only bringing them to court for the 1 month, if they end up getting a rent abatement for all of those months, it might turn out that the landlord has to pay the tenant and there's no eviction, and they might get some money back. Any other questions? Okay, great, thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Carisha Hawthorne Greer. I'm a staff attorney with the Volunteer Lawyers Project and the coordinator for the Housing Helpline. I am also the supervising attorney for our Attorney of the Morning program, which are two of our eviction defense programs. You heard a lot today about ethics, and you heard about the substantive area of landlord-tenant law. And so now we get to talk a little bit about the Housing Helpline and how it will work. So we're going to do a brief overview of the eviction defense programs that VLP has. We'll talk about the helpline. We'll talk a bit about the benefits of volunteering with the helpline. You'll see the forms that you get, and there's a resource center that's available to our volunteer attorneys. And then we'll talk a little bit about working with a helpline client, and you can ask questions as we go along. Okay. So the Volunteer Lawyers Project has two eviction defense programs, or Attorney of the Morning program, which has been in existence since the dawn of this program, that operates in the city of Buffalo, and it operates actually Monday through Friday, but VLP covers Wednesdays and Fridays, and Neighborhood Legal Services covers Tuesdays and Thursdays. And there are a few AOM attorneys here who volunteer. Basically, the setup of the Attorney of the Morning program is that you're at Buffalo City Court and you assist the tenants right there on the spot in the eviction proceeding that they showed up in court for. So you'll help them from either raising defenses, negotiating with the landlord, and basically getting them to resolve the case. The AOM program is only limited to the city of Buffalo. With additional funding, VLP was able to develop a program to cater to clients outside of the city of Buffalo. There is a great need outside of just the city of tenants who are going through eviction proceeding, and they really have no idea what it's like to be evicted, or they have some serious concerns with the relationship with their landlord or living in the property, and they need some guidance to go forward on their own and adequately represent themselves, or maybe make the conscious decision that, you know what, maybe it's not a good idea to go to court because there's a lot to lose here. And so with the Housing Helpline, this is it operates Tuesdays and Thursdays. For the volunteer attorneys, it's going to be between 12 noon and 2 p.m. If someone here today is interested in volunteering with the Attorney of the Morning program, or coordinator Jocelyn Nieves, I have her contact information on the slide. You can always reach out to her and she can put you on the schedule and give you additional materials regarding our AOM program. For volunteering with the Housing Helpline, I would be the point person for that. Okay. So what is the Housing Helpline? It's a legal hotline. Our number is 716-828-8460. So if you know anyone who lives outside of the city of Buffalo who are having landlord-tenant issues or being evicted, feel free to give them our number. They can get in touch with us Tuesdays and Thursday morning. Between 9 a.m. and 11 a.m., we do intake. Once the intake is done, then they will receive attorney callbacks on that day between 12 noon and 2 p.m. The legal advice that's provided to the client is only limited to the phone. The volunteer attorney will not be representing the client in court, and the client is made aware of this in advance. So the benefits of volunteering with the helpline. Outside of all the lovely benefits that Gail talked about in our overview of VLP, with the helpline, it only requires 2 hours of your time. And you can do it really from anywhere. You can do it from your office, you can do it from home, or you can come to the VLP office, and we have a desk and an office set up and a phone where you can do the callbacks with the client. There's malpractice insurance, there are trainings that are made available, we have a resource center, and we do a detailed screening of the clients and the legal issue before the case is scheduled for an appointment with our volunteer attorney. Okay, so how does the helpline work? So the first step is that the client would call in the Tuesday or Thursday morning. They will do an intake, and they'll be screened by either a VLP student volunteer or a VLP staff member. The screening involves gathering information regarding their financial eligibility, gathering information regarding how many individuals are in the household, their phone number, where they live, the property that they reside in. And we also do screening in regards to the legal issue, and you'll see a little bit later what that legal issue summary page looks like. It's very detailed to get all the necessary information for our volunteer attorneys to make that callback very efficient and successful for the client. Our goal is really to make volunteering with the helpline and with VLP in general very easy. We do all the legwork, and you provide your valuable attorney advice. Once the intake is done, the client is then told that they will receive a callback. They'll be told the exact time that they'll get the callback from an attorney between the time frame of 12 noon to 2 p.m. Whoever signed up to volunteer that Tuesday or Thursday, whatever attorney that's signed up to volunteer, they will receive their client call lists and the legal issue summary page no later than 15 minutes before noon. So that's about 11:45, to give you enough time to look at the list and kind of prepare yourself to make the calls. The volunteer attorney will then call the client back during their volunteer hours. The attorneys are generally encouraged, and we'll talk a little bit about this more, to limit their callbacks between 15 minutes to 30 minutes. Once you've done your callbacks for your session, your 2-hour session, it's then the volunteer attorney's obligation to return the attorney advice form, which you'll see later, as well as your attorney affirmation, which is what gives you your CLE credits for volunteering. And so for the 2 hours that you volunteer, you will receive 1 CLE credit. Okay, the role of the volunteer attorney. So as I said a little bit earlier, your role is really to provide brief legal advice and information. The most that you will likely do is assist the tenant with completing a written answer, and that's if the case warrants it. We have a template answer, and it should have been in your materials that you received, that we have generated that covers the basic defenses that are likely raised in an eviction proceeding. And so it's really a checkbox and writing additional information. Very simple. It already has the citation to the law and so forth. So if the case does warrant an answer and you go through that answer with the tenant and check the appropriate box, put in the additional facts, this answer will then be sent to the client, and they can print it off and then do the necessary legwork of having it in court. You'll also have the opportunity to advise the tenants of their rights. You would be surprised how many clients don't understand or know what the timeline or the process is for an eviction proceeding. So a lot of the calls that we get, or that you may get, may be someone just received a 30-day notice or 3-day notice, which is a prerequisite before they can go to court, and they don't know what to do. What are my rights? Does that mean the landlord can just now show up and take me out of the property if I don't pay my rent? What am I supposed to do? And so a lot of your conversation with a client is likely going to involve explaining to them what an eviction proceeding looks like. This is what needs to happen first, then this happens, and then this happens. You may also find yourself in a situation where you're providing negotiation strategies. So it could be a client who is clearly, they may have some room to negotiate with their landlord, but they don't know how to approach your landlord. What should they use as leverage? And so giving them the information as the best way to approach the landlord to either get more time or maybe enter into a payment plan to continue the tenancy. And the last part of what you might end up doing is also providing referrals. And the referrals can range from referrals to other legal services agencies to referrals to places like the Erie County Department of Social Services to get rental assistance. So let's talk a little bit about each step. So under step 1, the client calls in, they did the intake. The volunteer student screens the client, there's a phone consultation. Now, at the end of the screening and gathering the legal issue, the Volunteer student or VLP staff member informs the client of the exact time frame. We give them a window. So say the client is being scheduled for a 12 noon appointment. We say the volunteer attorney will be giving you a call back between 12 noon and 12:15. So it gives the volunteer attorney some wiggle room in case a call is running a little bit longer than anticipated or something else is going on. They're told that the attorney will be calling them back from a private or block number. It's possible. And so the volunteer attorney has the option, if you want, to private your number or block it in making the call. Some firms don't worry about this because they may just have a standard number that shows up when they make a call out, and so it's not an issue as to whether or not the client tries to call back. But one of the reasons we encourage you to block your number or private it is to prevent the situation of the tenant trying to call you back for further advice or information. Going the wrong direction. Okay, so the forms. So once we've scheduled the appointments and intake is closed, the email that's sent out to the volunteer attorney has two main documents, as well as other things, but two main documents attached to it. The first one is the appointment list. And so in the appointment list, what you'll get is the client's name, the time, the opposing party, and you'll also get the client's phone number, which is not included in this image. The benefit of the appointment list is if you open that first, you'll see the opposing party's name. So you'll get a chance to briefly scan to see if it's a landlord or corporation that may or may not cause a conflict that you or your firm may or may not represent. The other document that will be attached to it will be the legal issue page for each client and their appointment. And so this is a sample, and you should have also received a sample in your packet of what the legal issue page. And as you can see, it's very detailed. And this is what gets filled out by the volunteer student or the VLP staff member that does the intake. It has the client's name, the client's phone number, it has the property address, and it has the opposing party or attorney's information. We ask the client if they have a court date. So right off the bat, you know if this is a client that has a court date, and if yes, where the court is, what date and what time court is. We find out from the client how they received the paperwork. How did they receive the document informing them about court or any notices? It has the dates that's for each notices that's received. The legal issue page, the volunteer student checks what notice the student has received. So if it's a 72-hour warrant, so the student or the VLP staff member is already going through with the client, finding out what documents they already received. So when you get the legal issue page, that saves a lot of time in terms of you going over with the client again what the documents are. So you should already trigger in your mind, okay, this is someone who has a 72-hour warrant, so these are their options going forward. Or if it's someone who had just received a 3-day demand for rent, these are their options going forward. It has information in terms of how did they receive the notice, which will trigger whether or not this is something that may or may not have a jurisdictional defect because of service. Was it just posted to their door? So in this case, this person, it was only posted to the front door. It doesn't have anything in regards to certified mail or regular mailing. It has the monthly rent. We, the student or VLP, inquires from the tenant beforehand whether or not someone else covers portion of their rent. So the subsidized piece of it, you won't have to go through that analysis. We already screen for that. If it's a subsidized case, they're already getting the referral right up front from Neighborhood Legal Services. That client wouldn't get scheduled to speak with their volunteer attorney. We talk about if they have a lease or if it's a month-to-month tenancy, how much rent is owed, how much the client actually believes is owed, how much of the money they actually have. And then we also talk about the conditions. So going to the defense of warranty of habitability, we already screen what the living conditions are, if they're bad living conditions, and we detail that in the boxes. If an inspector has already gone out, the date of the inspection. But the box on this legal issue page that is going to be the most use to our volunteer attorney is this last box where it has the description of the legal issue or what questions the client has for the attorney. That's where, so in this case, There's a description. They received a 3-day notice. They are delinquent for rent for October and November in the amount of $10.81. The client had questions about the notice, their rights. They were not sure what happens after this point in regards to the notice. And then we scheduled that client for an appointment to speak with a volunteer attorney for 12 noon. Now, regarding conflicts, just to go back to the appointment list page, if a conflict does arise, the first thing you do is contact me. You'll have a volunteer attorney, they'll have my cell phone number, they'll have my office number, you'll have my email address. So you can text, call, email, contact me. If you receive the appointment list and you realize that there's a conflict before you start the call, you contact me. If you're on the call and maybe we missed something, so say the client didn't mention that there was some LLC or something else involved, and you realize that that's going to be a conflict, at that point, what we ask our volunteer attorneys to do is to immediately stop and advise the client that you can't continue to speak with them because there is a conflict. Determine when the client's next availability is for a callback, and then immediately contact me, and I will do the callback, or another volunteer attorney will do the callback with that client to advise them regarding that issue. Making the call. So, as I said earlier, we recommend the attorneys to block their number by dialing *67, or if your phone has FNC private feature option, you can also utilize it. If the client does not pick up on the first attempt, what we would like our volunteer attorneys to do is to leave a message, because they do have a 15-minute window. And we have the script that's available, and in the manual that's also available in our resource center does have the script for what that voice message can look like. It doesn't have to be word for word, but it does need to have a few things. Identifying yourself as a volunteer attorney with the Volunteer Lawyers Project Housing Helpline, and letting them know that you'll be giving them a call back in 5 minutes to discuss the legal matter. When you call the second time, you wait 5 minutes, you call the second time, and if the client doesn't pick up, at that point, we're not going to require volunteer attorneys to make a third attempt. You'll simply, again, identify yourself as a volunteer attorney with the Housing Helpline, let them know that this is the second attempt at reaching us, and if they would like to speak with an attorney, they can simply call the helpline again to get scheduled for another time. During the call, the volunteer attorney has access to our resource center. Now, our resource center is located on the VLP website. And if this works, it should pull up. In the resource center, you'll find a few documents that's going to be beneficial to you. Now, our resource center is password protected. If you do sign up to volunteer, you will receive the password. And then you'll have access to all the wealth of landlord-tenant law and the Housing Helpline to you. Yes. Oh, so I'm looking at the password protected, but you're not. So let's see if we can remedy that. Is it showing up now?
It is not.
Maybe I need to close out of the PowerPoint, which we can do quickly.
Yep. There we go.
Okay. So, as I was saying, it's password protected, and I may have forgotten the password. Don't think I did. Ah, there it is. So, in this resource center, you will have all the forms that are necessary to do your legal advice. So the first form that's there, and all these forms are fillable PDFs. So you can choose to print and handwrite it, or you can just open it up and type it in. So one of the most important forms here is the volunteer attorney advice form. This form needs to be completed for every client that our volunteer attorney speaks to. This is where you tell us what the legal advice is that you provided to the attorney. You just put your name, date, the client's information, phone number, the legal issue, which is the same legal issues as what was checked when you got the legal issue page. But the most important box where it says legal advice provided, if you keep everything else blank except maybe for the client name so I know what client it is, that's fine. But if you simply put client's name, and legal advice provided, and if you did any document preparation, I will be happy. Now, ideally, I would like the entire form completed, and it's a very simple form. It's all checkbox except for that legal advice page. So if you do provide any referrals, you can include it there, and then we would like you to ask the client how would they like a survey to be sent. We have a client satisfaction survey. Now, if you forget to ask the client that question, that's okay, because we at VLP do general follow-up. Now, the other document that I'm going to show you here, just 2 more documents in here. This is the tenant answer form that I talked about. This again is a fillable PDF. It starts with what we tend to consider the most important defense, which is usually jurisdiction defective services, then parties, and you have defenses to non-payment, defenses to holdover, and apartment conditions, which goes through the warranty of habitability, and then if anything else comes up. And so this is, if it's a case that requires an answer, you have that available to you. And then the last thing, so we also have a referral guide in here, but the last thing I want to show you is we have a Housing Helpline Landlord Tenant Manual. This manual is a detailed resource regarding landlord-tenant proceedings. It breaks down from the overview to the governing law to the course of a summary proceeding to the difference between non-payment and holdovers to what's required in pre-commencement notices, what a notice of petition and petition looks like, the contents that's required to be in there, the defenses, common defenses raised, what a court proceeding and trial will look like, the judgment, warrant of eviction, and then a frequently asked questions page. So this is something that you'll have available. It has all the citations to the necessary law, case law, as well as anything that a new person to housing work or landlord-tenant law would require. They would have this available to them. And the community referral guide, that's where you'll find contact information for neighborhood legal services, the other legal services agencies, as well as housing shelters and so forth, if you're providing a referral and you're not really sure where to send the person. So we have that available with the numbers, addresses, and locations. Okay, so let's get out of this. The other resource that you have available to you is myself. I am a practicing housing attorney, so if you are stumped on something and you want a quick answer and you don't want to scroll through any of those manuals, you can just shoot me a text, send me an email, call me, and I should hopefully be able to give you the response you're looking for. Okay, so this is what the attorney advice page, so this is what a completed attorney advice page would look like. So in the case of a client with a 3-day notice, when the attorney spoke with the client, detailed client received a 3-day notice, wanted to find out what will happen, explained the eviction process to the client, advised client that landlord will likely serve notice of petition and petition for a court date if he does not pay or move out, advised the client that if he wants to stay, he should try reaching out to the landlord to see if he's willing to work out a payment plan or give him some time, told the client that the landlord should not be changing the locks or putting his belongings out. One of the concerns the client had was, what happens if I can't move or I don't pay rent? What will happen? Can the landlord come and change the locks? No document was prepared, so that wasn't checked. The client also had some issues regarding IRS or food stamps. Now, you will likely not have that as any of the additional issues. We screen that at intake, and then or VLP staff does address those additional referrals. But it may be a situation where client wanted someone to go to court with them. Now, of course, you can't do that, but you can say you may want to try contacting the neighborhood legal services and going through their intake process to see if they're available to send an attorney out to take the case and represent you in court. It's up to their discretion. We can't guarantee whether or not NLS will take it. In this case, the client wanted the survey to be sent via mail, and they didn't require any follow-up materials. Time. Okay, so that's my time, which is good because we're at the end. Working with the helpline client. I just want to do this slide. So the key is establishing rapport. You'll have a brief period of time. So simply introducing yourself and saying your name goes a long way. Asking the client to describe the issue helps. I like using phrases like, I understand, thank you for sharing. You're all practicing attorneys. You've worked with clients. You know what it's like to talk with a client over the phone. So I'm sure you all have the skills to adequately build the rapport that's needed, because we have clients that are in crisis. They will tend to ramble on, or they may have trust issues and may not necessarily want to open up. Now, we tend to find that clients who call in for the helpline, they're looking for assistance, so they're pretty open with sharing and talking to you, because they just want some help. So they will share and sometimes overshare. The last form that's critical to making sure that your volunteer experience is a success is our attorney affirmation form. Without this form, you can't get your CLE credit. So it's really important that this form is sent back to us at the end of your volunteer shift, so that way we can give you the appropriate CLE credits for your volunteer time. And if you at any point you have any issues volunteering or any issues with any clients, or a legal issue comes up that wasn't covered either from the presentation today or in the materials that's available in the Resource Center, I would like to know that. Let me know, because we have law students who can do some research and memo writing and making sure that those legal issues are addressed, and then we can have that available in the Resource Center if it does come up in the future. Okay, last but not least, don't forget to sign up for helpline shifts. You can do so today. The first shifts will start in December, the first Tuesday in December. You can also sign up through the Attorney Resource Center, or you can contact me. But for the people who sign up today, you will get a goodie for signing up today. So keep that in mind. Any questions?
Yeah, there's no, what's that? Yeah, sorry, when we were realizing there was one last thing that we forgot that you probably encounter, hopefully not, but maybe you will. So you can take 60 seconds. That's illegal lockouts. The tenant calls and says, my landlord changed the locks. My landlord threw all my stuff out on the curb. I can't get back in. Oh my God, what do I do? That is an illegal lockout. Only authorized law enforcement, whether it be the city marshals, the county sheriffs, an authorized constable, can put somebody out. If the landlord does it without the help of law enforcement, without a court order, that is illegal. Tell the tenant, call the police. Get off the phone with me right now, call the police. The police, in theory, should come and tell the landlord to put them back into possession. Now go to court and do it right, is what the police should say. Some police agencies are more reluctant to get involved than others. I don't want to name any names because I'm being taped. But there are some law enforcement agencies that don't want to get involved. There are other law enforcement agencies. Okay, if the town or city police won't get involved, call the sheriff's department. If the sheriff's department won't get involved, have them contact the state police. Okay, the only thing that I would say is make sure that your tenant has talked to the landlord or has attempted to get in touch with the landlord. The landlord is entitled to change the locks anytime he or she darn well chooses, as long as they then give the tenant a key. So if they change the locks and they just never got together and the landlord's got a key for them, that's fine. Ask the tenant, have you spoken to your landlord? No, they're dodging my phone calls. Okay, call the police. So we're way over, so I don't know if we're going to do questions. I know I have to take right off, but we'll leave business cards, so if you guys have any questions, you can contact me or Christine or Carisha or anybody. We'd be happy to help you. All right, thank you.
So last thing, remember to fill out your evaluation form so you can receive credit for the CLE today, and sign out so you can also receive credit for the CLE today. And thank you all for joining us.